We're going to start our panel with a paper from GERGELY HUBAI from the University of Theatre and Cinema here in Budapest. The title is Visible Man, Invisible Film, the post-Trianon reconstruction of the Hungarian film industry. GERGELY, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello and thank you for having me on this panel. As you can hear, I am from the University of Film and Cinema and Theatre, which is at this stage in a very precarious situation, so I don't know if I'm even teaching or not. I'm just going to go and talk about what I wanted to sign on about. And basically, if you look at Hungarian film history, specifically the books about Hungarian film history, whether it's written for the layman or for the more academic crowd, the 1920s is kind of a black hole that is usually done in a few pages or even in a few paragraphs, simply because there were very few feature films made, and whatever was made didn't even survive. We have very few surviving films from this era, and basically there's nothing to write about. The only two things that these books kind of cover are either the theoretical works, like the works of Babes-Bolyai. The Visible Man came from that title. I find it very interesting that we have important theoretical work from the era regarding film without any practical background to back it up. And the other thing that they usually cover is the various laws and the various attempts of the government to reignite the Hungarian film industry to specific taxation and quota laws, which didn't really pan out. And usually you always come up with the same line that the Hungarian film industry basically doesn't really function in the 1920s because of Trianon. And I wanted to look at this claim because I think it's not that simple. There are many international phenomena that can also be reasons for this unusual situation, and these are usually related specifically to film history. So that's what I want to fill in. And the reason why I doubt that we have to blame only Trianon on for this treatment is that if you look at the other nations of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria specifically, the film industry is blossoming. They have gigantic studios, huge motion pictures, Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, Metropolis, all made in the same era when Hungary has nothing. So what is the difference? What could be the key difference why, not both, but in the end, all three countries are basically hit by the very similar conditions, and yet the German and Austrian film industry blossom, and the Hungarian one just goes into hibernation for half a decade. And after looking at and thinking about it and looking at the numbers, looking at statistics, I wanted to compile everything into three reasons. If I want, I could really add more, but I think there are three reasons in the end, and three is a magical number anyway. The first reason is what happened to the cinematic centers of Hungary. This is the reason which is most closely related to the Trianon Treaty. Specifically in Germany and Austria, the main cities like Vienna and Berlin and Munich were not really ravaged by the war situation. The cinematic arts could continue like nothing happened. Budapest was not so lucky, and specifically the second center of Hungarian filmmaking was Cluj-Napoca, Kolozsvár, which of course was one of the cities that was lost after the treaty. And Cluj-Napoca was actually in some ways more important than Budapest. In Budapest, there were many more film studios or film factories, as they call them, but they very much relied on the local theater scene. So basically, whenever they made films in Budapest, they were mostly filmed plays. They were using the same actors who played the same roles in theaters, so it wasn't that cinematic as contemporary filmmaking. In Cluj-Napoca, some of the greatest Hungarian filmmakers started there in Corvin. And they made basically because they couldn't really fall back on the theatrical background, they made movies which were much more cinematic. Unfortunately, again, many of these are kind of lost. from the era, the first big Hungarian movie that got international distribution, The Yellow Fall, is one of the missing movies. It was made in 1913. And basically, we only have a handful of movies that survive from the pre-Trianon era as well. We have Atolons by Michael Curtiz, which survives somewhere abroad. And we have Aranyember, The Man with the Midas Touch, which is by Alexander Koda, again, barely survived through a German language print. So because the reason we lost the cinematic centers either through war or Trianon, there was no infrastructure to create the movies. That was one big difference. The second thing is the personnel who made these movies. The early cinema of Hungary was very much, as I said, dictated by theatrical tradition. And the first really inspiring, really standout filmmakers were those who basically started out their careers as students of the cinematic arts or film critics. Alexander Koda was actually a film critic before he started first directing and then producing movies. And all of these people, most of the great people, were heavily involved in the Hungarian Soviet Republic. The Soviet Republic, those 133 days, was incredibly rich in film history. In those 133 days, they have shot 31 feature-length films. Again, only one of them survives, called Yesterday, but we know for a fact that there are at least 31 films made, and there could be even more that we don't know about. Now, all of the great directors took some part in the Soviet Republic, not just as filmmakers who were serving the system, but also as party commissaries or people who were given more administrative tasks that, of course, later on was unacceptable. All these people, including Korda, Michael Curtiz, the future creator of Casablanca, for instance, or Béla Lugosi, who is best known for Dracula, had to leave Hungary after the Soviet Republic. First, they usually went to Vienna or Berlin, and then they went either to London or Hollywood for even bigger possibilities. So it goes to show that because we lost these people who were the most talented filmmakers in Hungary, actually they went somewhere else and they built up a different film industry, the German and the Austrian one. They made some great historical biblical epics there that would possibly not exist without the involvement of these major names. So these two things are related. The German and the Austrian film industry could possibly flourish because the Hungarian personnel who were the best were working there for political reasons. But again, not quite related to Trianon. And the third thing is the Horthy regime's conflicted relationship with film. As I mentioned, the Soviet Republic was immensely prolific with films. So for the new regime, film was kind of like a communist art form. And we know that Lenin considered it the most valuable art form as well, the most useful for spreading propaganda. And while in the Horthy regime, they kept making newsreels and all kinds of very didactic and pragmatic short films, they really didn't want to focus on feature films. They clearly favored theater instead of the cinematic arts, which they had to because of the other two reasons. The film factories were kind of in shambles, and the personnel who created the best movies were already abroad. Effectively, by the time they made the first cinematic laws, the ones that control how films are shown and distributed in Hungary, it was already the middle of the decade. And there were two key organizations that took care of these things. The first one was the Hungarian Film Office, whose primary interest was creating newsreels, documenting Hungarian life, and they mostly signed the various trade agreements between international companies, such as with UFA. They would ship Hungarian newsreels to Germany, and the Germans would provide newsreels from German and overseas events to Hungary. Cinemas, eventually all cinemas from 1926 onward had to show these newsreels. It was compulsory, but they are newsreels. They are not really film, so to speak. And the other thing was the Hungarian Film Fund, which is what would be closest to a state organization responsible for the betterment of Hungarian cinema, and specifically the Hunnier Studio, which was very closely related to this company. Basically, the idea was to introduce quota regulations. And here's the other interesting things. What other country can we think of that's similar to Hungary in this respect? Germany and Austria are clearly above us. And our surprising brothers in this fight for cinema was actually Great Britain. The British and the Hungarian film industry was both in very problematic circumstances, meaning that there were no nationally produced movies for different reasons. And eventually, what happened that at around the same time the Hungarians introduced their quota laws, the British introduced their own regulations. These quota regulations meant the official wording was that we want to have a healthier ratio between foreign produced and locally produced movies. But for some reason, the Hungarian plan didn't quite pan out while the British did. And what was the biggest difference there? The Hungarian regulation basically stated that distributors of foreign films had to pay taxes after every meter of foreign film they want to show. Originally it was 20 fillers, and then they doubled the price for 40 fillers. And eventually this came up into about 1 million tenge a year, which was quite a sizable amount. The British also had a similar agreement that you could bring in American movies based on how many meters of film you want to bring into the country, but they had another solution. And the other solution is the one that really caught on. Apart from paying taxes as punishment for showing foreign movies, the British regulations kind of embraced the idea that American studios should bring work into Britain, specifically shoot movies in Britain. And by giving work and, of course, salaries to the British professionals, they are directly contributing to the British film industry. American studios rushed at the opportunity. So instead of paying these punishing taxes, they would create what we call quota quickies. Now, don't be fooled. These are not good movies. Usually, they are the bare minimum of what we can consider a movie. They are about 65 minutes long because that's the minimal length of a feature-length film that was accepted based on the regulation. And very often they have a very flimsy story, and they have many musical numbers because those take up a lot of time. But they existed. The Hungarian equivalents never existed because foreign companies were not encouraged to do this. Of course, I'm not expecting that American Hollywood studios would come to Hungary and shoot here, but easily we could have modeled the regulations based on the British one by encouraging the German film industry to bring workforce here. And eventually, by the 1930s, it kind of worked that way. Many movies were shot parallelly in German and in Hungarian, specifically to create working opportunities in both countries. So the biggest problem here that even though there was money and there was this 1 million tenge income from the National Film Fund, many movies were started and never finished because, again, of the inexperienced personnel. And I'm not talking about inexperience in the technical field. There was that. But basically, there had these producers who had no idea how to fund the film, what to spend money on, and what to, save the bucks on it. Often they spend so much money in pre-production that they didn't have money for the post-production, meaning they would end up with feet and meters of undeveloped film and canisters of useless garbage simply because they had no money for the post-production. Again, this comes from the fact that because they came from usually a theatrical background, post-production is not part of theater. The sets, the costumes, the actors, the script, that's all. That's what they know. But they never thought about music, editing, and sometimes even the distribution was kind of misfinanced. So because of this reason, we had some unfinished business. And the other real problem was that something else happened. Besides the great financial crisis, besides Trianon, there was one more thing that really changed about how film was distributed. And that was the appearance of sound film, which was a gradual process between 1926 and 1929. And most national film industries flourished because of this. Many people forget that when we talk of silent movies, it was done for a completely different market. Because silent movies practically liberated the film industry. If you made a good quality movie, it was possible to show it anywhere simply by cutting down the inserts, the intertitles, which had, let's say, Hungarian text in it. You translate it, you put in the German, you edit it back. So Hungarian movies or German movies could easily be shown abroad. Of course, because every movie could be shown everywhere in the silent era, it was mostly about quality. And this is where Hungary really faltered. The Hungarian movies were simply, whatever was finished was not good enough quality to take abroad. The American, the German, even the Austrian, even the Italian film industry and the French, not to forget the French, they were much better quality, and because you only had to change the intertitles, you could show them anywhere. The appearance of the sound film really closed up the markets based on the language borders. So that's when Hungary had to figure out what to do with their own film industry, because they couldn't bring in the foreign movies anymore. Subtitling was not an option. Dubbing was incredibly expensive. Dubbing cost as much in the first few years as making a brand new movie, and it still sounded horrible. So that was the reason why in the 1930s, with the appearance of sound film, the Hungarian film industry kind of realized where it was going. They had the Blue Idol, the first ever Hungarian sound film, wasn't a big hit, but then the second one, Hippolyte the Butler, that was a big hit. And a big hit enough that it was eventually remade in the German territories as well. So that is the reason why the Hungarian film industry was kind of this academic black hole, and still is, because there are still very few, maybe there are 1 or 2 movies that we can actually view, and funnily enough, never in the original Hungarian intertitles, always through German copies. Like the movie is the same, only the text is in German. Man with the Midas Touch, or Átokvára, which in English is The 1,000-Year Curse. Both of them are Hungarian movies, but only survive with the German text, and the Hungarian text is only translated back from that. With the appearance of sound film, things changed. Hungary was kind of forced to focus more on its film industry, and up until then, there was this decade of cinematic dark age, which, as I wanted to point out, is not just related to Trianon, but a whole host of other events, some of which are specific to Hungary, some of which are specific to World War I, but many of them are international trends where Hungary simply came off from the short end of the stick. That's my speech. I'm opening up to questions.
Great, thanks very much, Gergely. So because Gergely has to go and teach right after this, we're going to take questions on his paper right now. But then when we move to EDINA and Julia's papers, we'll take questions at the end. So right now, just questions for Gergely, please.
Go on.
Extremely simple question, but did Trianon matter for this industry? Because you demonstrated it was not important, but
as I said, it was the reason I said it's a bit more difficult to answer that, because there were a host of other reasons which are not. So, is the Soviet Republic related to Trianon? It happened before, but it happened because people already knew what was coming up. I would say that the only way Trianon, the actual border changes related to this, was the fact that we lost a lot of potential market, a lot of territories, and Cluj-Napoca, which was simply the more cinematic cinema center of Hungary. As I said, Buda was making movies, but it fell too much back on the theatrical tradition. So effectively, they did film plays. Cluj-Napoca was, for instance, Korda movies were the first ones to use shots outside studios. In Budapest, they would have the studios. They would sit down 2 actors. They would talk. The text would be shown like their dialogue box, and that's it. In Cluj-Napoca, they kind of work more with body language, more with expression. Some of it is, of course, quite goofy today, that they all do these like big expressions, but back then it was a step forward in the right direction. Losing that infrastructure and specifically losing the personnel, usually because of their involvement in the Soviet Republic, was a bigger blow than the border change itself. But basically I wanted to do the talk because if you take any Hungarian film history, they would just, as they say, blame it on Trianon and move on it. I just wanted to show it's a bit more complicated than that.
Great, thank you very much. Any more questions? Yes, we have one from Gabor. He's going to come up and ask it here.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, so thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I'm interested in, I don't know whether you have an answer. It's the question is grown out of my experience with Romanian archives, where I have found among the police material a lot of documents on the censorship of movies and the regulation of what kind of movies could have been shown in cinemas and in which form, whether with Romanian subtitles, whatever, so that kind of. But my impression was reading this extremely large amount of material in those police files that still in the 20s and the 30s there was a kind of very functioning regional market for films. Hungarians were everyday occurrence in movies in Brasov or Karansebes or whatever. So I'm interested in how much this Eastern or Central European market, whether we can speak of such a phenomenon at all, and if yes, how did it work with all these new borders, censorship regulations? I think that was probably more important than the borders. Whether you have anything?
Yes, I can give you some pointers here. Hungary always has been more closely associated with not the neighboring markets, but the German and the Austrian market, specifically because most of the personnel who were professional, they spoke German. And when it was time to leave Hungary, they mostly went in that direction. They didn't go to Romania, they didn't go to Slovakia, they went to Germany. And basically, when we've struck up deals like about trading movies, the first one was always UFA, the German company, and very little involvement with the neighboring countries. One example I can give, I forgot the name of this. In the 1930s, they had this movie, and it had something about some kind of haunted mansion kind of thing. I remember it opens on a train, and this movie was shot in Hungarian and in Romanian as well, which I found very interesting, because usually when we did these so-called parallel productions, which meant that once they set up the sets, they built the sets, they brought in a crew from another nation, and in the daytime they would shoot the Hungarian cast and crew, and at night time they would shoot with the foreign cast and crew. Usually the foreign cast and crew were German, and for this movie it wasn't German, it was Romanian. So that was kind of like and in Romanian specifically. So that was like an exceptional kind of parallel production, but otherwise the Hungarians would always stick closer to German things. And regarding censorship is basically I think that most of the movies at that point weren't really pushing the envelope. They did it in America, but those movies rarely made it to Hungary. So basically, as long as something was accepted in Germany, it was kind of accepted in Hungary as well for a while. So there was a Hungarian censorship board. They would review the movies, but they would usually go just for the most obvious political things. They wouldn't really meddle with the feature films, as far as compared to something, let's say the Hays Code in the US, that was much stricter than what was in Hungary.
Okay, thanks very much. If there are any last questions, we can take them. No? Okay. Then let's all say thanks to Gergely. Gergely, thank you very much.
Off to my other classes. Thank you.
Super. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the presentation. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Okay, everyone. Next on the panel, we have a paper from EDINA from Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj-Napoca, or Kolozsvár for our Hungarian colleagues. The title is Orphaned, Abandoned, Denationalized: The Takeover of the State Children's Asylums After 1918. EDINA, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Cluj, Kolozsvár. My presentation will be about the politics involving abandoned children, representing only a fraction of the changes affected these children. The subject of children generally has grown into a considerable object of historical inquiry in the past decades, while the history of child welfare and education was entangled with the history of nationalism in the multi-ethnic empires and the successor nation states. I'm positive that with the new nation will contribute to the Transylvanian case study of this subject. I'm talking about the state children asylums, and my main objective is to identify the extent of denationalization from the narratives and the statistical data available in the reports of the institution and the medical discourse. Due to the availability of sources, I will emphasize on the Cluj asylum from Transylvania and the Timișoara asylum from the Banat. In historical Transylvania, the majority of the population was Romanian, while Hungarians represented 35% of the population and Germans only about 8%. There was a discrepancy between the urban-rural distribution of the nationalities. Cities were predominantly Hungarian, while the countryside was mostly inhabited by Romanians. The Banat was ethnically much more diverse. Hungarians represented only 15%, and many of them were colonists settled only in the 19th century. Germans represented 25%, while Romanians 37%, and there was also a significant Serb population. The asylums started their activity in 1903 in 18 major cities of Hungary. They are not to be confused with orphanages. They accepted any child declared abandoned from infants up to 15-year-old teenagers, and instead of institutional care, the children were placed to foster parents for a fee. Foster care was a modern concept that was better for the child's development rather than the close environment of an orphanage, where they grew up in isolation from the outside world, getting out unprepared. The Hungarian system was internationally appreciated. On national level, over half of the children admitted in the asylums were illegitimate, and 44% of the mothers were housemaids. Married parents in deep poverty could also count on the institution, but their child would be taken away and placed to another family. Foster parents were selected from the so-called colonies, which were settlements where at least 30 families accepted fosterlings. Directors preferred farmers to craftsmen and considered the countryside a healthier environment than the city. The colonies and foster parents were selected in order to serve the nationalist ideas of the state. They were exclusively Hungarian. The asylums denationalized the abandoned children from other ethnic groups by raising them in Hungarian foster families. The statistics of the pre-war period show that the nationality of the state children in these 5 asylums didn't correspond with the ethnic distribution of the countryside. This is explained by the high number of illegitimate children coming from the predominantly Hungarian urban areas. For example, in 1906, 63% of the newly admitted children in the Cluj asylum came from the city of Cluj. The situation was similar in Arad, Oradea, and Timișoara too. In the latter, there was also a significant German-speaking population. After 1918, the Romanian administration took over the management of the institution and changed the director physicians. Romanian doctors recognized the efficiency of the asylums, which functioned by the same rules during the whole interwar period under the name of child protection centers. Only the nationalist agenda switched. Gheorghe Popoviciu, the new supervisor, took an important part in the re-Romanianization of the state children of Romanian origin, who were replaced to Romanian foster families. Some, however, were simply Romanianized. The directors emphasized that the reassimilation was based on the nationality of origin and promised correctitude towards nationalities. They encountered many difficulties during the relocations. The children raised in Hungarian families since infancy were already assimilated with the nationality of their foster parents, so Romanian culture was a stranger to them, especially in the case of older children. Similar to the case of German children of Czech descent in Czechoslovakia, state officials defined nationality according to descent and not language, considering one's own declaration of national affiliation insufficient. Although being objectified, the state children often ran away and objected to their relocations. Like, for example, before tracing the final border lines, Lazar Popovic recalls the children he brought back in late 1919 from Békés Csanád and Toronto counties, cried, "Leave me home, I am not a Romanian and I don't even want to be, for they are smelly and ragged." This map shows the colonies of the Cluj asylum. The former Hungarian colonies were all placed in predominantly Hungarian villages that were gradually closed and new ones were established northeast to Cluj in the Nassau region. Romanian narratives emphasize the love for children and patriotism of the Romanian population of the region. Primary sources, however, show that at first request, the families weren't so enthusiastic about the fosterage program, and most of them asked only for older boys who could be used in agricultural work. In February 1920, the prefect of Nassau County expressed his disappointment in the local authorities and urged them to take the necessary steps and place the children by any means, because the replacement was an order and not a humanitarian request. Finally, in the summer of 1920, they announced the arrival of 373 children. Of the 373, it turned out that only 41 were from the Cluj asylum and the rest were brought from Timișoara. Taking the children far away from their familiar environment and cutting off any connection to relatives facilitated their integration in the foster family, and it was more unlikely that they would run away from such long distances. Contrary to the statements of correctitude towards national minorities, there were Serbs, Slovaks, Bulgarians, Ruthenians, and Croatians among the Timișoara children placed for re-Romanianization, who were in fact the subject of denationalization multiple times. From the Oradea asylum, they were also taken far from home to the old Romanian kingdom. The asylum had a colony in Muscel County, where they took many Hungarian children too. An official ended a journalist's inquiries about them, saying, "The Hungarian asylums were the propagators of Magyarization. Now it works the other way around. Parents, if they still had one, could retrieve their child. An example is known when the parents of a Hungarian boy from Oradea addressed directly the Ministry of Work, Health and Social Protection in Bucharest to get back their 7-year-old child from the Valea Popi colony in Muscel, placed in state care only a few months before." An important question is that how many of the admitted state children actually integrated in the foster family. This table shows the results of Axenteancu's research from 1938 about the state children placed in foster care by the Cluj Asylum after 1918. Only 7.6% of the children integrated in the community of destination. It shows that some Hungarian children settled in Romanian colonies such as Ilva Mare or Rodna Veche, but it also reveals that Romanian children were still placed in Hungarian colonies, even by the Romanian administration, because they had difficulties in finding Romanian foster parents, especially for the infants. In the old colonies, the foster mothers offering for breastfeeding already had the basic hygienic knowledge on how to properly care for a nursling. The Timișoara Asylum also had to rely on the former Hungarian colonies for placing infants under 2, where fosterage and wet nursing became an industry in some villages before the war. Some even bragged that had care for 50 state children. But after the babies grew, the institution had difficulties in finding Romanian foster parents. Some old Hungarian colonies still functioned even in 1938, when, according to a newspaper article, about 40-50 state children attended the public school of Tormák-Végvár. In the Banat, the Romanian colonies were established in the Romanian villages near the old colonies. Iosif Nemoianu, the director physician of the Timișoara Asylum, didn't glorify the humanitarianism of the Romanian peasants and their love for children. He expressed his difficulties in finding suitable foster families because, except the ones who didn't have a child of their own, the others wished only to exploit the children's labor force. The small fees after the war didn't motivate the foster parents either. For example, they placed 107 older children in Turnus Severin near the Danube, but soon turned out that the locals used them almost as slaves and thought that the asylum was meant to supply the town with servants. Iosif Nemoianu offers a more realistic view on the asylums, and his narrative isn't dominated by exaggerated nationalist rhetoric. While Popovici stressed the wounds of the Romanian population, Nemoianu recognized that of all nationalities, the Romanians were the least affected by denationalization through the asylums. He explains this by the fact that they weren't predominant in the big industrial cities, which gave the highest rates of abandonment. He was aware that only a few months were enough to denationalize small children, but only under 10% of them reached age 10 in state care, while others reunited with their families. This chart shows the ethnic composition of the newly admitted children before and after the war in the Cluj and the Timișoara Asylum. In the case of Cluj, in the interwar period, the percent of Hungarians decreased significantly because the asylum turned its attention from the illegitimate children of the big cities towards the rural Romanian population in order to spread hygienic knowledge in the previously neglected countryside. By 1936, 86% of the state children came from rural areas in the Cluj Asylum. This is also visible in Timișoara. Nemoianu said that caring only for the abandoned children, the dregs of society, was a luxury since many babies not qualified as abandoned died out of negligence and the lack of hygienic knowledge. He initiated large projects to investigate the sociological and medical causes of the decreasing Romanian population of the Banat region and stressed the importance of rural dispensaries and visiting nurses. Influenced by eugenicist views, pediatricians were much more interested in the health of the future generation by assisting the infants and their mothers who didn't qualify as abandoned, rather than investing only in the often unhealthy elements admitted in the asylum, like morally decayed, incurable, mentally and physically ill children. This had started already during the dualism in 1915 with the Stefania Association for the Protection of Mothers and Infants, establishing local offices all over Hungary. Nemoianu envisaged the asylums as the centers of a general child protection system that coordinated the assistance. While Nemoianu in the Banat worked on the improvement of the child protection system inherited from Hungary, in the old Romanian kingdom, many of the asylums established according to this model still didn't function properly or were only in a planning phase. The Transylvanian doctors, after recognizing the efficiency of the asylums, wished to expand the institution in the Old Kingdom, but in order to do so, an accentuated nationalist rhetoric was more than necessary to convince the government from Bucharest that this foreign institution is worth keeping if adapted to Romanian needs. The St. Ekaterina Nursery in Bucharest also found foster care so efficient that started the preparations for a colony already in 1923. As some final remarks, with the annexed territories, Romania also inherited a child protection system that was far the best at the moment in the new country, which was also used as a political tool previously for Magyarization. Some Romanian doctors exaggerated the losses to the nation, overshadowing that the main and incontestable objective of the Hungarian state child protection system was to overcome infant mortality. Others recognized that the Romanian population was the least affected. Furthermore, few have integrated in the community of destination, and for most state children, state care was only a temporary phase, and they reunited with the family. The Romanian administration endeavored to re-Romanianize the children of Romanian descent, but Romanianized minority children too. Because state children represented only a fraction, less than 0.5% of the total child population, one gets the impression that the principles and the invested efforts were more important than the actual number of the children saved for the nation. Thank you for your attention.
BAVOUZET. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institut für Österreichische Geschichtsforschung at the University of Vienna. Her paper is entitled State Transformation in Post-Habsburg Hungary, the Ministry of the Interior and its Personnel, 1918 to 1920. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me today. I will talk about a somehow different topic, which is the administration and moreover the state transformation that occurred after the First World War. And well, I hope the subject will interest you. In this communication, I intend to study the state transformation in post-Habsburg Hungary at the level of the central administration. Ministerial bureaucracy indeed represents the core of the state, this distant abstraction which civil population only encounters through local authorities. However, close focus at the day-to-day practices in the ministries, and especially the interior in charge of the administration, allows to get the measure of how shaken the Hungarian state was after the disappearance of the imperial framework. How did central administration face the multiple challenges in the post-war situation, and how could it or not ensure the continuing of the administration, which is the state's control over local authorities? Beyond the political perspective of the revolutions, this communication will develop a pragmatic approach focusing on actors, quotidian issues, and practical dimensions of this transformation. Paper shortage, communication line failures, reuse of the blue folders of the previous regimes will be addressed as material evidences of the state's weakness. It is, however, during this peculiar time that ephemeral state formations, such as the People's Republic or the Soviet Republic, emerged, carrying vast reform projects, often going with major restructuring, aiming at the whole democratization of society. Using the Hungarian ministries as a case study, this communication proposes ultimately to question the state transformation, transition, rebuilding paradigm in a context of rapid changes, but ultimately of deep continuity in the administrative practices and personnel. What was the Hungarian Ministry? Located in the government district up in the castle in Budapest, it was, after the finances, the second biggest of the 9 resort ministerium, in charge of public health, police forces, and before all, of supervising the regional and local administration. The war deeply affected its functioning, and central bureaucracy took over the leadership of local autonomous administration. The staff also rapidly increased, although drastic cuts in the budget led to rethinking the efficiency of work practices and introducing accelerated procedures. Centralization and bureaucratic authoritarianism defined the wartime administration, in time when state reinforced its power and control over civil society, which would unleash a backlash against bureaucratic authority after the war. The Interior appears to be one of those ministries whose attributions have not been affected by the imperial collapse. However, after 1918, its effective work was deeply shaken. The situation may not have been as severe as, for example, in the case of the diplomacy, where the whole new Hungarian Ministry for Foreign Affairs had to be created from the ruins of the Bauhauptplatz. Still, the massive social upheaval in the counties surrounding the October Revolution forced many civil servants to leave their offices, as did the imperium handover in the territories falling behind the demarcation lines. Recent scholarly research illustrates many aspects of this imperial handover at the borderlands, and the question of refugee civil servants, which profoundly reshaped local administration. However, this situation presented also a huge challenge for the central administration, struggling to ensure the continuing and the cohesion of the state. In early November 1918, Minister Batyányi issued a first telegram to all district headquarters, commanding every civil servant to remain in their offices. This first attempt was rapidly followed by other circulars, switching for a more begging tone. Still, hundreds of county officials abandoned ship, and by December, an adjunct secretary was appointed in the ministry to handle the demand of, I quote, county officials forced to leave their offices due to the extraordinary conditions. From his office in the Castle district, Pál Hegymegi Kis tried to coordinate the transfer to vacant positions in other counties via the official communication channels, but also relying on local press to reach a broader audience. Facing the huge amount of work, he was given 2 concipisten, and by January, a new ministerial department was created to deal with refugee civil servants. What was intended to provide a temporary solution until public order is reestablished actually became the core of an important attribution of the Interior, as the state's territory shrank and refugee crisis worsened over the years. The files of this department record step by step the suspension of communication, the flows of refugee civil servants, and the scale of the reconfiguration that occurred in the local administration. They reflect the actual extent of the Hungarian administration far more genuinely than official publications and registers, offering a false look of normality. The refugee department is just one among those created after the war. During the immediate post-war years, the ministry was under constant restructuring, which also contributed to transform the state. Changing structures and increasing number of departments reflected the growing state apparatus, alternating from excessive specialization to repeated attempts of rationalization and grouping for better efficiency. The social welfare progressively emerged as an autonomous attribution, soon transferred to the newly created Ministry for Social Welfare and Public Work. For a brief time during the Soviet Republic, the Interior also supervised the railways and the navigation, and a politically sensitive detective department was created. The ministry was also symbolically relabeled Commissariat, what reinforced the sense of rupture. After 1920, the National Office for Refugees overtook the management of the refugee issue. Moreover, several complete restructuring reshaped the departments until they stabilized in the mid-20s. The war and its aftermath indeed acted as a catalyst, providing a major boost to radical state reforms. However, if we consider not only the institutional structures, but also the ministerial personnel, what emerges is an apparently great continuity during the interwar. In 1927, the very first issue after the war of the state register, the Tiszti Címtár, recorded 71 senior officials in the interior, all of them having served without interruption since before the war, most of them in the very same ministry. This impressive continuity at the top of the hierarchy during this time span of 20 years deserves a special mentioning. It overlooks, however, the turbulences that occurred during the rapid changes following the imperial collapse. Personal records attest that after October 1918, the entire civil service corps remained almost without exception in function. On the contrary, major social changes occurred during the Soviet Republic. Out of the 162 civil servants working in the Commissariat of the Interior, only a half came from the former ministry. The newcomers were mostly appointed in the newly created departments, the politically sensitive detective and police departments, or the one devoted to refugees. Example of the section's chef János Zborai, a politically unreliable old imperial servant who was suspended in the first days of April. However, a month later, he was passing by his office and he accidental friend and colleague who told him he had been affected to the exoneration department and therefore everybody was looking for him for weeks. And indeed, amidst the general disorganization, Zborai finally received his official assignment. Funnily, he waited until then to present himself to the presidential department as a sign of silent protest. Indeed, some of the laid-off officials were later reintegrated to remedy the rampant lack of personnel. Facing a politically unclear situation, civil servants indeed tended to ask for leaves, arguing for some medical issues, in order not to get too much involved with the Soviet regime. 3 to 6 weeks were regularly granted by an understanding hierarchy, which in this case too acted like a Harzana rebellion. Some others simply disappeared without any notice, leaving the capital to take shelter among relatives in some remote country. Sometimes unbelievable stories emerge from the archives of the commissions created after the fall of the Soviet regime to purge the administration from the communists. Keeping in mind the retrospective nature of this source, they provide rich insights in an otherwise largely unknown Soviet administration. For example, we can read about a concept adjunct forcefully enrolled in the Red Army, trying to escape from his regiment somewhere around Miskolc, then rambling through the country until he was found by the Romanians, who arrested him, threatened to hang him, but finally released him after he could exchange a couple of words in Romanian with them. The poor fellow then encountered the French, who accused him this time of being a communist, but he managed to get in touch with his section chef in Budapest, who warmly recommended him to the French authorities. Released for a second time, he returned by foot to Budapest, where he arrived in the middle of August 1919 and presented himself to the re-established ministry to get his position back. This adventurous episode is not a unique one and gives a glimpse at the level of disorganization prevailing by then, when not only county notaries and refugee civil servants, but also ministerial Konzeptsbeamten were rambling on the roads. The archives of these commissions also record the large-scale political purges progressively implemented after the fall of the Soviet regime, which once again reshaped the administrative body. Starting in August 1919, at the initiative of the agrarian minister, the revision procedure proceeded during 2 years to the review of all civil servants' behavior under the so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, according to the traditional formula. All individuals appointed since March 21 were simply dismissed with no pension whatsoever, but the revision also extended to those who have been appointed during the Károly Republic. This revision is though a crucial landmark in the progressive amalgam of the two republics and the fabric of the single enemy, a narrative forcefully asserted by the counter-revolutionary regime during the interwar. The return to the constitutional order also meant the reactivation of all officials dismissed by the communist regime for political reasons, and by August 3rd, the official journal of the Interior published a general call to all revoked civil servants, exhorted them to, I quote, present themselves forthwith to their former offices without further notification. During the fall, successive governments endeavored to resume with the legal continuity and to close the disruptive parenthesis of the revolution. And indeed, as the Tisztítszínta for the year 1927 shows, continuity prevailed at the level of the personnel. Still, beyond this continuity, the immediate post-war events profoundly transformed the relationship between civil servants and the state, with long-lasting consequences. The first, and maybe more obvious one, is the brutal and definitive intrusion of politics inside a supposedly neutral institution. The politicization of the bureaucracy already started during the First World War, as the Ministry of the Interior had become the first instrument of the government politics. It became, however, more general after the October Revolution. Civil servants were encouraged to participate to political parties, and trade unions were created in the ministerial administration to oversee decisions related to staff policy. The overall politicization of civil servants ultimately aimed at infusing a new democratic spirit in the administration and concern about the people's best interest, as repeatedly emphasized in ministerial circulars. The scale of the political purges in the Soviet Commissariat of the Interior attests to an even more politicized atmosphere. Civil servants were expected to attend communist meetings, hang red flags in their offices, and parade on 1st of May as any other proper workers. New expressions infused in the official discourse, shaping new practices and writing habits civil servants had to adapt to. Alongside the old guard of imperial officials, newcomers forcefully implemented a different worldview, transforming the very ethics of public service. This temporary transformation did not last for long. However, the progressive installation of the counter-revolutionary regime, with its own rhetoric and ideology, carried over the politicization of civil service. All the more, as the 2-year-long revision procedures of every single individual led to the dismissal of many left-wing elements, completing the total submission of civil service to political considerations. Beside political purges, the issue of the official oath also sheds light on the increasing submission of the state apparatus to political goals. As in other successor states, The official oath became a heavily discussed issue in Hungary and has been repeatedly reformulated during the intermittent post-war period. As soon as November 2, the day after the Károly government swore to be faithful to the National Council, the formulation for the civil servants was modified, and every state employee had to swear to remain faithful to Hungary and to protect its independence. The formulation was indeed quite consensual. All the reference to the king, to whom civil servants were formally still bound, vanished. The vague formulation also reflects the general indetermination that prevailed until the proclamation of the Republic on November 16. By December, a new formulation was decided, which mentioned the Republican form of the state, and civil servants had to swear again, this time with more reluctance. For example, we can see in the archives that the previous consensual formulation sometimes continued to be used, and not only in remote municipalities, but also in central offices. After the proclamation of the Soviet Republic, the formulation was once again modified. The day after the proclamation, Vice Commissioner for Justice István Ládai proposed a new solemn declaration, a traditional oath appealing to God no longer being an option. During the political vacuum that followed the fall of the Soviet Republic, successive governments had no time to elaborate a new oath, but by April 1920, a circular from the office of the Prime Minister defined once again a new formulation, this time swearing allegiance to the governor, Miklós Horthy. The repeated modification of this highly symbolical ritual highlights, however dubious these attempts to force civil servants' loyalty may have been. Even the ephemeral state building in Divír in Szeged organized its own ceremonial oath-taking to assert its legitimacy. Successive oath-taking certainly contributed to rephrase a sense of duty and political neutrality, either in a politicized way to a singular regime or to the abstract idea of the state that lay beyond. A second long-lasting consequence of the post-war state transformation is criticism against bureaucratism. Criticizing bureaucracy and cumbersome administrative procedures may be as old as bureaucracy itself. Yet war provided a special occasion to question the state and its practices, a process even more acute in defeated countries prone to self-blaming. Indeed, it was a reaction against wartime bureaucracy and the reinforcement of control over civil society that unleashed an ultimately disastrous backlash against bureaucratic authority after the war. This process started during the Károly Republic. However, the Soviet Republic made a step further while introducing 3 weeks accelerated courses to give, I quote, civil servants a socialist qualification and an education freed from bureaucratism. On March 22, the official daily paper, the Red Newspaper, even published an editorial entitled "Down with the Bureaucracy," describing administrative power as an anti-class war element. The editorial called for shaking off the legal restraints of a bureaucratic organization and giving way to revolutionary instinct and arbitrary violence in the conduct of affairs and justice. Indeed, democratization of both society and administration took the shape of an even sharper struggle against bureaucracy, representing the prestige and the power of the traditional noble elite. Criticism against excessive bureaucracy actually remained a leitmotif in policymaking during the whole interwar period. It drove the urge to implement a great administrative reform repeatedly called for during the dualist era, though without coming to a solution. It also greatly influenced the so-called civil servants question brought on by the overflow of administrative personnel in the reduced country. Debates surrounding the staff reduction politics definitely exceed the chronological boundaries of this presentation. Let's just mention that within the time span of a decade, more than a third of all civil servants in the interior had been dismissed. This last point rejoins the issue of the politicization, The year 1918 undeniably constitutes a caesura, but the war also acted as a catalyst, urging for implement long postponed reform. Moreover, recent historiography invites us to look beyond the obvious ruptures to see the underlying continuity. Gary Cohen already insisted on the powerful legacy the monarchy left in law and public administration, what more recent publication also illustrated for many successor states. The post-war period, though, presents a real cognitive challenge. Despite the continuity, 1918 was unquestionably a turning point and a rupture in constitutional order for Hungary. This paradox should lead to a paradigm shift, forcing us to abandon the binary opposition of rupture versus continuity and consider the whole complexity of this great transformation. Taking a closer look inside the central administration allows a better understanding of the transition in practice. On the one hand, new politics were implemented to cope with new situation, partially relying on old workforce and procedures. Amidst political turmoil, structural reforms and creation of offices attest the inventiveness of an administration facing unprecedented challenges. Indeed, in about 4 or 5 months of existence, the ephemeral republics, with no governing experience, managed to reshape public administration, though in a dictatorial manner that could not but face general opposition. The state-building experience in Szeged was less successful, although its very existence offered an alternative legitimacy on which the counter-revolutionary regime could build its own. On the other hand, practices of transition also reveal the ambivalence, reluctance, and individual strategies of civil servants who tried to make their way through the political turmoil. This bottom-up perspective may provide interesting approach in time when state transformation left the country hard to discern at all. Thank you for your attention.
EDINA, I have a question for you about the afterlife of this experience for these children. I mean, the question for me is, okay, there's this rhetoric that somehow abandoned children or foster children are these dregs of society, as you quoted in your presentation. But my question is, was there any sort of tracking of their experiences afterward about reintegrating into society? And where did they wind up? I mean, among which types of social classes, or what were their sort of, you know, as teenagers, young adults, and so on? Is there any way to track who these people, who these children became? And then for Julia, I also have a question. You were mentioning that some of these officials, when they were fleeing the Tanácsköztársaság, that they were winding up in the hands of French and Romanian army troops because they were seeking refuge elsewhere in more remote parts of Hungary. But I'm curious, I mean, for the Ministry of the Interior, this is covering a much larger space than the sort of rump state that Hungary became after 1920. So do we have any, you know, stories of other officials being caught by Czechoslovak troops, for example? Or for Yugoslav troops who are coming in the south, and what became, these portions of the South Slav state after October 1918. So if there are any additional experiences in addition to these French and Romanian excursions. EDINA, would you like to go first?
Yes, okay, thank you for the questions. Regarding the afterlife of the children, it is very hard to track them down. The first problem is that in many cases we don't have names. We don't know their names. There are a few sources mentioning that, for example, some children came back to the asylum and asking the institution if they could provide work for them, for example, after turning 15. But most of them, according to the sources we have, for example, boys learned crafts. They probably were apprentices for a very long period, and after that they try to manage with the craft they've learned. There are also notes that some resorted to criminality because they didn't have any other chance. But I don't think either that this was general. I think what was general is that most of them reunited with the family after all, maybe after 15. For example, according to an autobiographical novel, the author, Nagy István, he was also in the state child protection system for a very short period. Because he was an older child, he was placed as an apprentice, but he too reunited with the family. It is very hard to draw conclusions, and regarding the dregs of society, it's how Nemoianu put it. It was a quote from Nemoianu, the director. Yes, some were from unfavorized environment. They got there because of the poverty of their parents, or they were ill, but this was not a general case. I think most children were there temporarily, only temporarily. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Julia, I'll turn to you.
As for your very interesting question, thank you very much. Yes, of course, there are also several other stories about civil servants in other borderlands, which also illustrates the geographical origins of these dualist civil servants, because they not all came from Budapest. Actually, it's like very interesting anecdotes, so I haven't researched in this. I knew about another story from a civil servant hiding in Budapest in the friend's apartment, and his colleagues went searching for him at home, and even his wife had no idea where he could hide for so long. So it's more like I tackled the subject more from the perspective of the disorganization of the state, when nobody knew actually where the civil servants were. But these cases, these encounters with foreign armies are more like exceptions, and so dramatic exceptions.
Great, thanks very much. So now we'll turn to, we have Gabor has a question, is that correct? Gabor will come up and ask one. Balázs, you have a question? And we also just saw that Chris has a question as well. So we'll go one by one, huh? Okay, great. Now they're all pouring in, very good. Gabor, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much. I have actually a question for both of you. For Julia, you were speaking of the politicization of the civil service as a kind of consequence, and you used as an example and also a form of politicization the trade unionization of the civil servants of the ministry. And I was wondering whether it would be useful a bit look at it a bit more differentiated way to distinguish between certain types of politics in this regard, because this trade unionization, as far as I would conclude from my knowledge of the interwar, wartime years and the issue of provisioning, could have been also connected with the fact that during the war, this kind of middle class, and especially the state administrative officials, were actually very negatively affected by the provisioning. They felt a kind of loss of social status vis-a-vis the working class, whatever. And at one point, it seemed to me that for them, to a certain extent, imitating the social democratic way of provisioning was the way out of this problem. And for example, in Kolozsvár, the very first act during or after the revolution was to establish that kind of administrative trade union with Emil Hatziaganu and a few Hungarian officials as its leadership. And the manifesto of this trade union is very much focusing on somehow remedying all the ills of the middle class, and not more specific political claims or demands associated with certain political parties. So it's not even necessarily a kind of social democratization of the ministry, although it could be. I'm not familiar with that case. And for for EDINA, I have actually two questions, comments, and the first one is that you used frequently the term denationalization, and I'm sure that it's very much figuring in your sources. But I was wondering, especially if I think of the age of these individuals, how much we can think of them at that age as kind of nationalized beings who could later be denationalized. So what would your take on this issue? This is the first question. And the second one is kind of more of a comment. I'm always fascinated by these Romanian childcare issues because I read a bit on the of the material of the American Relief Administration in Romania, in Hungary, Austria, and they actually saw a very clear divide between the new provinces and the old kingdom. And they didn't even want to establish something so elaborate as existed in the new provinces in terms of childcare. In the old kingdom, they were they definitely saw it in. We can see it as a kind of colonial perception of what was going on in the old kingdom, and whether and I was interested in how much these but it was also meant to be a kind of transfer of knowledge how to do things properly. So whether these international, transnational transfers figure in your sources regarding childcare, asylums, whatever, and also whether there was a kind of later political use of this issue, not policy in policy terms, but at the level of politics, like it happened, for example, with the unification of the judiciary, as we know from research most recently from Francesco Magno's research. Thank
you. Well, maybe I can answer.
Yeah, go ahead.
Gabo's question. Well, Gabo, although I don't see you, thank you very much for this interesting question. And I very much like your way to say that civil servants were imitating the social democrat ways, because well, for what I saw, it's exactly like that. I still describe this as a politicization. Because, for example, we can see that senior Konzeptbeamten restrained from this participation in trade unions because they also shared different social or political habitus. So it's also a new way to implement a new worldview. For example, the Bizalmi rendszer that was implemented in the ministries in November 1918 differed very much from former political association or corporatist association like the Magyar Tisztviselők Országos Egyesülete. So it's a completely whole way to negotiate with the state, and in this new way I describe this as also a kind of politicization. But still, you are right, it's not the same as the real participation in political parties or voting. But anyway, thank you very much.
Yes, so for the first question, I'm totally agreed with Gabor that I use the term denationalization, but of course that can be said for a 2-year-old child, because as a nationalized being, but this is a term they use. Their main interest was the language that the child learned. That is the sense that they were interested in, to place the children in a certain family, firstly to learn the language. In the case of older children, they had more difficulties because, for example, the ones placed in Hungarian families, when they were replaced, they probably didn't even know the language. Well, about the national identity of these children and their impression, is very hard to know what their impression was. They had probably language difficulties. And about the second question, yes, about this transfer of knowledge, there were many comparisons between the Transylvania system and the system in the Old Kingdom, and they emphasize all the time that the Transylvanian system is more advanced, and that is what they wanted to transfer to the Old Kingdom, as it was in Transylvania, with very few changes, and they had certain plans, but they didn't function. And about their political use, I'm not aware if they used them in the same way as they did in Transylvania before. Did I answer it?
Guy was going to come back up so we don't get a feedback loop.
Just very quickly, I'm also interested in whether some kind of international dimension of this transfer figures in, because the activity of these relief organizations also meant, and children were actually a dedicated target of all of these, from the Red Cross to the Children's Relief and the American Relief Administration. So whether they not only brought material goods, but also that kind of intellectual goods in Romania.
Interestingly, in the sources of the asylums, there is no mention about the international relief program, as if it never existed, which is very strange, even for me. I even look for it if there is any comment on international child relief in the asylums, but there is none. In the director physician's work, they only talk about local associations for child relief, but only local and not international. And I still can't answer to this question: why isn't international child relief present in the narratives of the state child protection system that I have read so far?
Chris first. Okay, Balázs is deferring to Chris, who's going to ask a question for Julia.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So thank you both, first of all, for your excellent presentations. And actually, Cody's question first just kind of got me thinking about this, but Julia, you were talking a little bit about the, so kind of the origins, are saying that these officials in the Interior Ministry were actually coming from geographically very different places often. And I was just wondering about, in this period of transition, is there any, and forgive me if you talked about this, but is there any concern about some nationalization, or is the fact that they're coming from a kingdom that already understood itself as a national state, and that they're serving in the Interior Ministry itself, does that kind of preclude this issue from coming up in this period of transition for these bureaucratic officials? So short and sweet, are there national concerns that come up?
Thank you very much, Christopher, for your question. Actually, the nationalization of the Hungarian administration, the Magyarization of the administration, occurred half a century before, and every individual envisioning a career in the administration was Hungarian, not only with citizenship, but with knowledge of language and also patriotic affiliation. So in this regard, there is no in the Budapest Ministerium, there is no question of nationalizing the administration because the administration is Hungarian. We are in Hungary. The question is more rephrasing the territory of Hungary because, well, with the demarcation lines and all the border shifting before the peace treaty, the state could not exercise its authority in the national territory. So the national question is not the identity of the civil servants, but rather the extent of the state's authority, because it's the political authority that define the political or military authority that define the national state by them. National question occurs in the common ministries of the Habsburg monarchy, especially in the foreign ministry, because as I told, a new Hungarian foreign ministry had to be created. And the decision was to take over the Hungarian civil servants in the Bauhausplatz in Vienna, to build this new ministry, to transfer them in Budapest. But research on the common foreign ministry showed that it was very difficult to actually assign one nationality to the civil servants there, because they may have a different citizenship, different languages they spoke, different affiliations. They were most of them aristocrats who were crossing the boundaries of the two halves of the empire. So the national question rather occurs in these common ministries, not in the central administration of Budapest. I hope this answers part of your question.
Great, thanks very much. And now Ola Jablonci is going to have a question too. Okay.
Thank you for this both presentation. My question goes to Julia BAVOUZET. It's about this the question of you have mentioned this question of the refugee civil servants, government high commissioner Pál Hegymegi Kiss, I guess, and later you've mentioned the Office National for the Refugees. In your opinion, is there any kind of continuity in the state policies regarding refugees, or is it completely different things? One is for so-called branch politics for the Ministry of Interior, and another one is maybe perhaps an issue for the whole nation, or there is some kind of continuity in the institutional memory of the Hungarian government? Thanks.
Thank you. This is a very interesting question. It's not exactly the core of my topic, so I cannot answer this question. My first impression is that the nomination of Pál Hegymegi Kiss and then the creation of this first department of the refugee civil servants in, I think, December 11, 1918, it's a total improvisation. So there is no real politics about it. It's like there are Hungarian civil servants, they are on the road. We need to ensure the continuing of the Hungarian administration. We need to do something with them. So it's not about the question that will later be raised about shall the Hungarian state still pay the retirement pensions or the salary for the civil servants outside of the national border. Then a real politics needed to emerge by this political turmoil, 1918, 1919. No real politics emerged, but certainly this first institutional framework of this refugee politics, refugee administration, certainly had consequences on the later institutionalization of this administration. So it's a very interesting question which needs some further research, but there is something to look here. Thank you.
Balázs gave you the thumbs up, and we're all going to give you the thumbs up too because we're at time. So we're going to take a break now, but first let's thank everyone for the presentations. A round of applause here in the room.